We're going to talk to various people now, including Louise. It isn't her real name, and we are protecting her identity to protect her two adopted teenage children. Also with us, Libby. She has an adopted daughter with fetal alcohol syndrome and is worried about what the Adoption Support Fund cap could mean for the treatment she receives. We're not using Libby's surname. Vaughan is here, Clinical Director of Family Futures, which provides therapy and support paid for by the Adoption Support Fund and amongst others. And Hugh Thornbury is here, Chief Executive of Adoption UK and also the Chair of the Adoption Support Expert Advisory Group, which is a government group. I'm going to introduce Julie as well. Julie's got in touch with us. She's a member of our audience. Julie's not her real name. She adopted her son when he was 6. By the age of 14, he had become violent and aggressive, and she and her husband took the decision that their son needed to go back into care. Julie, hello. Thank you very much for talking to us. Tell our audience a little bit about what you experienced with your son between the ages of 6 and 14.
We experienced a lot of violence, mainly towards myself. Extremely violent, where I would have to call the police and they would have to calm him down.
What kind of things was he doing?
He would hit me with, he'd pull the poles off the curtain rails and whack me with them. He would just hit me generally and scream at me, throw things at me, smash things up in the home, lob things at me. He was just extremely aggressive and violent towards me.
Wow. And presumably that is related to the first 6 years of his life.
Yes, it was extremely. He came from an extremely violent background, drug and alcohol difficulties, and he was born heroin addicted himself.
Right. Age 14, you took that incredibly difficult decision that he would go back into care. Why did you make that decision?
I made the decision because he was having an effect on the younger sibling, his full sibling in the home. And also he kept absconding from us. He would run back to the birth parents and they would secretly keep him away, and then he would turn up a few days later after a police hunt for him.
Can you give us an insight into what it's like to make a decision like that?
It's absolutely heartbreaking because it's just awful. It's really hard. It has an effect on you forever, I think. We just, we'll never stop loving him. He just needs seriously so much help that we just couldn't offer him, and we couldn't get that from any authority. They just wouldn't accept it, that he needed extreme help.
Yeah. Jay, you work in terms of therapy for children similar to Julie's son.
Absolutely.
What would you say to Julie? I mean, she's clearly feeling guilt for what happened.
Absolutely. It's just so sad to hear that. And I think it's so familiar. There are so many families who we've seen sort of close to that point, and sadly some where it has disrupted. And I think sadly Julie's right, this is a grieving process which is very hard to grieve because the child's still alive. You haven't lost a child in the same way, but you're left with all those feelings of loss. So it takes a long time to recover from, and I think there needs to be more help, which is of course why we're all here today talking, to really help these families not get to that point, because these children do need intensive, comprehensive help.
Julie, stay with us as we talk to our other guests here in the studio, and please be part of the conversation, because what you've described is heartbreaking, as you said. Louise, you adopted siblings. I want to ask you, what did you know about their background? What had social workers told you about their background?
They told us most, I think, of the information that we needed to know. As far as they knew it. They told us that their birth family were addicted to drugs, and mother had been a prostitute, and that there were members of the close family were in prison.
Right. And in terms of you bringing up your adopted children. Tell us what that was like.
For the first few years, I think a lot of adopted families are so happy to have a family. We soldiered on, and in spite of flagging up various behaviours, it wasn't until we flagged it up to the school who helped us to get support. And once my son was about 7, we realised we really needed more support than the local authority could give us.
And before you were able to access that support, how close were you to this adoption breaking down?
We were just overwhelmed. I think the stress that a child's trauma is transferred to the adoptive parents, and I think that the stress that we felt was so overwhelming that we couldn't see straight. So actually we knew we needed more support, but we didn't really know what that support should look like.
Yeah.
We needed expert help. And there's a lot more of it around now, because this was a few years ago, but there's still a complete lack of support for parents who are in our situation.
What support did you get as a result of money from the Adoption Support Fund?
Luckily, we were allowed to return to Family Futures, where we had been before, and then a funding had stopped and we'd been back to CAMS, who at that point didn't help. Luckily, the Adoption Support Fund came in, and so we were able to go back to Family Futures, which was fantastic for our children because they built up trusting relationships with the therapists there. What
do you think about this cap now, £5,000 per child? You know, to most taxpayers, they'll be thinking, well, that's plenty of money.
Yeah. Well, it's not enough. If you actually think about how much a therapist costs, and therapy for a child that's been traumatised and their families isn't just go in for an hour, lie on a bench and somebody talks to you and says, breathe deeply. There's a lot more to it. So we do art, we do drama, we do music, we do yoga, we do, as well as talking therapy. Yeah. There's so much more sensory integration work.
Does it work? Because I know some people will be thinking, oh, you do art, how is that going to help a kid from a heroin addicted mum? Tell us how it works.
I think these children come with such complex problems that it is about, you need a complex solution, and you need a very holistic approach. And if one thinks about how trauma affects the whole body and the nervous system, the whole way a child is wired around the trauma. So when we're thinking about creative art techniques, it's largely because for a lot of children, expressing themselves verbally is not easy. It isn't a way that always accesses for all of them.
Why does being able to put it draw something on a piece of paper, why is that a release for them? If they can't express it verbally, why does the art help?
It provides another way of expressing the unexpressible. Yeah. What these children have been through sometimes is so horrific. How do you find words for it? Whereas actually if you can paint it, and I think there was some artwork used in your film earlier, if you can paint it, if you can act it out, it is another way of expressing it rather than reenacting it on the adoptive parents or on the sibling. That there is a need, we all have a need with trauma to tell others about it, but it's about finding a safe way of communicating.
Right, Hugh, let's just talk about this Adoption Support Fund, because when I look at the total funding from the government, it's going up 19 million to 23 million. Yes, the amount per family is going to be capped at 5k, but the Department for Education say if there is need for more therapeutic support for a child where it exceeds that 5,000, the funding will be split between the local council, if the council agrees, and the government, effectively. So therapy could still be paid for up to £30,000, £40,000, £50,000.
I think one of the great things about the Adoption Support Fund, which we really supported at Adoption UK, is the fact that it began to address the postcode lottery, because there's a level of need that has been unmet for a long time that you've been hearing about. Some local authorities have been much better at recognising that and meeting it than others. So if you roll back 3 or 4 years, it's a very, very mixed picture across the country. A national fund has helped to sort of equalise that. And it's definitely benefited now nearly 8,800 families. I think by bringing in the limit, it does obviously potentially risk those children who've got higher levels of need being able to access the service they want. And we've seen, because there's been a limit imposed this last year, we see that some local authorities are prepared to match fund to bring the amount up. Other authorities are refusing to do that, probably because of cuts to their budgets. So the risk is we're moving back into a situation where, depending on where you live, you either get a reasonably good service or
Although
no
the Department for Education again say 80% of applications to fund to the fund are under £5,000 per child, so under the limit.
That's right.
That's most of the applications.
The average is about £4,000.
Right.
So the majority's needs will still be met with the fair access limit that's been brought in, but it does pose the issue of some of the cases we've just been hearing about that will require a far greater degree of therapy than that over a period of time.
Yeah.
And the big missing thing here is the discussion about mental health services, because the government put £1.4 billion, which puts the fund into sort of perspective, £1.4 billion into additional services for children's mental health. Mm-hmm. Half of the clinical commissioning groups in the country, the GP-led groups that decide how funding's used, have spent that money on other things. It has not gone to those services. Okay. So we need to talk about the fund and how that's helping and what some of the limitations are. We also need to understand there's a bigger issue here about the fact that many of these children have significant mental health needs, and they are not being met by the health service at the moment.
Let me read this email before I bring Libby in. It's from a viewer who doesn't wish to leave their name. We have 2 adopted children who've been with us for 4 years. Our son is 13, our daughter is 9. They mean everything to us and we have a very happy, loving family. However, our children experienced neglect and abuse for a long time with their birth families before they were taken into care, and it's extremely challenging at times. I completely sympathise with those adoptive parents who've had to take the heartbreaking decision to place their son or daughter back into care. Very few people understand just how hard adoption is. For us at this time, it remains the best thing we've ever done. But without support, we don't know what may happen in the future. And that is your worry, I think, Libby, as well. You have a 3-year-old daughter. She's here today. You got help from the Adoption Support Fund back in March last year. Why did you need that financial help?
So my daughter has fetal alcohol syndrome. And,
explain what that is.
Before I adopted her, I knew there was a lot of alcohol consumed in pregnancy, so I knew she was at risk of having either physical or emotional or behavioural issues linked to that substance misuse.
So her mum was an alcoholic?
Yeah, she definitely did a lot of binge drinking in pregnancy. I mean, a lot of the drinking happened before she knew she was pregnant, so it happens a lot in the country where people drink and not realising that there are no safe limits in pregnancy is part of it. But she did come with this future risk of fetal alcohol syndrome. Mm-hmm. But after she was placed with me, it became very, very clear very quickly that this was a definite need that she had. She had quite significant sensory issues, and that's kind of...
What does that mean?
So she's very young, and they'd kind of said before she was placed that she didn't like loud noises, but I hadn't quite comprehended or understood how limiting that was. She couldn't cope with the sound of vegetables being chopped on a board, the hoover. I remember when she first moved in and she was asleep and I switched the light on downstairs and it woke her up. She's so hypervigilant that she isn't able to regulate noise.
So just let me ask this point. So the social workers said, look, she may have a problem with loud noises, but you hadn't understand the extent. Do you feel they didn't give you enough information, or perhaps they just gave you what they had, they didn't know anymore?
I think it's what they had.
That does come up.
I think that's what often happens is also there'd been a change in social worker right at the last hurdle, so the social worker that had been involved the whole way through was never the one I dealt with, and I do feel quite fortunate with her local authority that they have been supportive. And what I kind of understood was that in the future I was probably going to deal with fetal alcohol, but there was no real expectation that it was going to be immediate. And I think also the change in placement, the moving to live with me, taking her away from her loving foster parents was probably just a catalyst for what would have naturally happened anyway. But it did mean that, and it was said a lot, the child that I was placed with was not the child that anybody had expected.
Wow.
And both in good ways and bad ways.
No, I'm not knocking that. But you've had support from the Adoption Support Fund, and in what form does that take with your little girl?
So it became really clear to me that she needed occupational therapy, sensory integration, so a way to help her manage her senses, a way to be able to leave the house without her having an aggressive meltdown because she couldn't cope. And I did my own research and I managed to find a really good organisation called On The Go Occupational Therapy who specialise in that, and contacted my social worker, but again with the Adoption Support Fund it clearly says they won't pay for occupational therapy, so initially I funded it myself, and then we realised that they will pay for occupational therapy if it's sensory integration, and it's these weird kind of wording things where I come across adopters and they're like, well, we know that they won't pay for that, and there are limits to it. So the other thing that my daughter needs is speech and language, which I can't access on Adoption Support Fund either, but once I'd accessed it, it was completely life-changing, and we've been really fortunate.
Okay, so let me ask you finally then, Hugh, you've got concerns, you've laid those out. As we've pointed out, the total budget has gone up, but you say we now regress to this postcode lottery again. What can you do?
Well, what we can do is to raise these issues. My group monitors the use of the Adoption Support Fund. It gets information on which local authorities are using it, which aren't. We get intelligence about whether people are waiting too long for assessments and so on. So at Adoption UK and those I work with, we'll continue to try and ensure that this money is easily accessed for those families that sort of meet the criteria for it. We will continue to persuade government that it needs to continue to invest in adoption support, because I think we're only beginning to see the full extent of the level of need.
Yeah.
Many adopters have been completely detached from the professionals because they've asked for help and haven't received that help in the past. So I think one of the reasons there's pressure on the Adoption Support Fund is that, you know, up to about 25% of families, adoptive families, have been experiencing real difficulties, now beginning to realise that there's something that might be there to help them. And that obviously puts pressure on the amount of funding that's been put in place.
Final thought, Jay, from you. As far as I understand it, official figures are not kept on how many adoption breakdowns there are. I think the estimates range from about 3% to 9% to even a third.
That was the Alan Rushton research, saying that a third of adoptions are okay, a third struggle and a third disrupt. And I think what's clear in Julie Selwyn's research, and there's a bit that explains it in her write-up, is that actually because records aren't clearly kept, we just don't know actually how many adoptions are breaking down. Our experience as an organisation is that there is a high number of people breaking down or close to disruption. And I was going to say, in the last week, we've had 2 families saying, actually, we don't think, if there's no funding, we don't think we can go on. We are going to be having to say to the local authority, we can't do this. So it is a real serious problem, and I think with the capping, I'm very worried how it's going to happen.
What's going to happen. Yeah. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Jay Vaughan from Family Futures, Hugh Thornbury, Chief Exec of Adoption UK, thank you. Libby, thanks very much for talking to us. Louise, thanks for your time. And Julie, I really appreciate you talking to us on the programme to talk through what decision, what heartbreaking decision you took. But we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.